Professor Rייכמן, founding president and chairperson of the board of directors at Reychman University. Sherry Arisson, the owner of the Arisson Group, a businesswoman and a philanthropist. Jason Arisson, chairman of the Ted Arisson Family Foundation. Doreen and David Arisson. Rachel Cohen, CEO of the Ted Arisson Family Foundation. And Professor Amnon Lehavi, the provost at Reychman University, distinguished guests. Former Prime Minister Rabin once said that leadership is not about asking the public what they want and implementing it. Leadership is about understanding what the public and the state need and convincing the public that this is the right thing to do. And we have to admit that ESG is not at the peak of its popularity over the world, and we hear Trump saying drill, baby, drill, and we see the EU kind of limiting ESG regulation initiatives. Still, environmental and social problems are here. They are probably here to stay. They will not go away. And we need to find ways to solve them. And more generally, we need to keep ESG as part of the ongoing conversation of businesses, part of the managerial toolkit. And for us at the Arisson ESG Center, this is what we consider as leadership. We need to convince everyone that this is important. So the Arisson ESG Center, which is led by my colleague and friend, Professor Eli Buchspan, indeed, together with Yair Avidan, who we've seen here, and Ruth Dagan, Dr. Ruth Dagan, is trying to do exactly that. And when we launched when the idea to launch an ESG center like 3 years ago, the Arisson family and the Arisson Foundation were the natural partners for such an initiative, because you can see that even today, when many people have turned their heads against ESG, they are still really taking the values of environmental and social behavior that are deeply rooted in everything they are doing, and I think this is the best partner that we could have found. And with their help, I think we did a lot in the last 2 years since we started to operate. Tons of research that you can find on our website. Lots of teaching, so we have for the 3rd year within the center an student intern program with 30 students. Another important initiative is the Climate Tech MBA, headed by Dr. Michal Volken, who is also here with us, that we launched this year. And as of next year, we will also be opening a double major BA in business, tech, and sustainability. So we are doing a lot in that respect. We have weekly blogs, tons of roundtables with the industry. And I think that our role is also to offer new, and sometimes dramatically new, ways of thinking about how businesses should engage with environmental and social issues. And today we are honored to have with us Sir Professor Oliver Hart, who is the holder of the 2016 Nobel laureate in economics, and probably one of the most influential economists that many of my colleagues here grew on the things that he wrote. And he will be speaking with us on value or welfare for shareholders, and basically democracy and the business sector. And then after Professor Hart's speech, we'll be having a panel that will discuss the applicability of the ideas that Professor Hart will raise to the Israeli economy. So this was me, and now it's Professor Oliver Hart.
ערב טוב ותודה רבה. For inviting me. It's an honor for me to speak to you tonight. And this is the topic. So let's get going. About 60% of Americans invest in the stock market, many through their pensions. Now, the next bullet point turns out to be incorrect. Niron Hashai has told me that actually the percentage of Israelis who invest in the stock market is much bigger. I got this information from ChatGPT. So, you know, I always trusted it 100% before this, but apparently one should not. Anyway, that's good because that means what I'm going to say tonight is even more relevant because the number of Israelis is similar to the number of Americans. Now, you know, when people are thinking about how to invest in the stock market, there are plenty of sources of information for them. The libraries are filled with books on how to invest. Financial advisors will advise you, but nobody tells you, or certainly nobody tells ordinary investors, that when they invest, when they buy shares, those shares come with votes. And this gives them some power to influence what companies do, but also maybe some responsibility in what companies do. I think many people don't even realize that there's any voting going on. The majority of people invest not directly these days, but through institutions such as mutual funds. And the voting takes place is done by the mutual funds without most investors even being aware of what that this is going on. Why are we in such a situation? I think the answer is that according to the conventional wisdom, investors want the highest financial return possible, and the best people to achieve this, when it comes to voting, to elect the appropriate boards of directors who in turn will choose the appropriate CEOs, the best people to do this are professionals, like mutual fund managers. They know all about how to maximize financial return. So it's just fine for them to vote on our behalf. They don't have to ask us. They know what we want. That's the conventional wisdom. Where does it come from? I think no one has had a bigger role than Milton Friedman. In an incredibly influential 1970 New York Times article, he wrote, and I'm going to quote this, I'm going to read it, in a free enterprise private property system, a corporate executive is an employee of the owners of the business. He has a direct responsibility to his employers. That responsibility is to conduct the business in accordance with their desires, which generally will be to make as much money as possible while conforming to the basic rules of the society, both those embodied in law and those embodied in ethical custom. Now, Friedman recognized that shareholders were people and that people are not only interested in money. He understood that many people have social goals, but he argued that they could achieve these by themselves. They don't need companies to do it for them. At the time Friedman was writing, a big issue was whether corporations should give to charity. And Friedman's argument is that they should not. It is better for a company to pay a higher dividend, okay, not to give to charity, then has more money, it can pay a higher dividend to shareholders, and then each shareholder can decide what fraction of that extra dividend to give to their favorite charity. We don't need the companies to give to charity on our behalf. We can do it. Indeed, if they do it, they may give to the charity we don't want them to give to. So I think in this example, he's very persuasive that companies should just stick to maximizing profit and making shareholders wealthy, and then they can decide how to use that wealth. He's persuasive in this case because, to use economic jargon, companies do not have a comparative advantage relative to shareholders in giving to charity. So that's why they should stay out of it. Now, Luigi Zingales and I, and the whole talk today is based on work that I have done with him, and which is, we've written several academic papers that have been published, and we also are completing a book, which you'll have to wait for it, but it's going to come out in the spring of 2027. Anyway, what we have been arguing, and will argue in the book, is that charitable contributions are a very special case. Companies do not have a comparative advantage relative to shareholders in giving to charity, but they do in other activities. And then Friedman's argument that firms should maximize profit because that's what shareholders want breaks down. Let me give you an example. Suppose you own a dry cleaning business. You can make more money by dumping a side product, a hazardous chemical, in the local river. Let's suppose this is not illegal, but you know that people living downstream will suffer. Do you do it? Some people may answer yes, but many will say no. In contrast to the charity case, the dry cleaner does have a comparative advantage in avoiding pollution. You know, the Friedman argument would be, if it's more profitable to pollute, the company should do that. Then it can pay a higher dividend to its shareholders, or to the owner, you. And if you don't like what the company's dumped in the river, well, then you can go and clean it up. That's like giving to charity yourself. Okay, obviously, as soon as you put it that way, it sounds ridiculous, and it is ridiculous because apart from the fact that if there's more than one owner, you would have to coordinate the cleaning up, there's the more fundamental issue that cleaning up the waste may cost much more than any profit you made from dumping it in the first place. Okay, so the conclusion of this, the implication is that if the owner, and I was assuming you were the only owner, but it's true when you have several owners, if the owner or owners are socially responsible, they might prefer not to dump the chemicals in the river in the first place, even though this is not profit maximizing. Okay, so this just shows that Friedman's logic is incorrect. It's a case where a socially responsible shareholder or owner may actually wish the company not to maximize profit. What Luigi and I have argued is that the appropriate objective for a company is not profit maximization, but what we call shareholder welfare maximization. So shareholder welfare includes profit, but it also takes into account shareholders' moral preferences, how much they are willing to accept a lower financial return for the greater good. In the dry cleaning example, the greater good would be not dumping toxic waste in the river, toxic chemicals in the river, is that what I called it? The hazardous chemicals, sorry, in the river. Not doing that, because you know that if you do that, people downstream are going to get sick. Now, I should make one thing clear. We do not deviate from Friedman in the following respect. And also here, we're not deviating from most corporate governance scholarship in that we accept shareholder primacy. So we are talking about shareholder welfare, not stakeholder welfare. Why not, you may ask? Well, the reason is that we respect the way companies are set up. And most companies are set up in such a way that the shareholders have the votes, not other groups. And that suggests strongly that the company is meant to act on their behalf. And so we're sticking with that, but we're simply taking the view that shareholders as human beings may have other objectives than money. Well, Friedman thought that too, but then he thought they could pursue all those objectives by themselves. And we're saying no, sometimes it's efficient for these objectives to be pursued through companies, or at least that companies shouldn't do harm to other people. Now I'm going to take another example, which is actually more dramatic, not least because it's real. It's a real-world example. So it involves a well-known American company called DuPont. For years, DuPont, so it's going to sound a little like the dry cleaner, except it's going to be at a much bigger scale. For years, DuPont dumped into the environment tons of PFOA. I'm not going to try to read that, but you can see what it stands for. A toxic, forever chemical used to produce Teflon non-stick pans. So that's what DuPont was producing, and this side product was PFOA. And it was toxic. And, okay, you're going to see that they did something which led eventually to litigation. And one of the advantages of that is that we have a lot of information. And what lawsuits have demonstrated, one thing is that DuPont knew from the mid-1970s that PFOA was dangerous. In 1984, DuPont managers had to decide whether to dispose of this safely or dump it in the Ohio River. Well, there are going to be no prizes for figuring out what they did. They dumped it. Now, I'm interested in the following hypothetical. Suppose you were a DuPont shareholder at the time, and you could have voted on the decision. How would you have voted? Okay, of course, this decision was never put in front of shareholders, but I think it's still interesting to consider what the reaction would have been. We know from court documents that the cost of PFOA's proper disposal, so if they disposed of it safely, it would have cost $19 million in 1984. $19 million, which is roughly 58 million in today's dollars. Now, at the time, there were about 240 million shares outstanding. And so the cost of proper disposal in 2025 dollars was less than a quarter, that is 25 cents, a quarter of a dollar per share. So if you were a small investor who owned 100 shares at the time, that would be a cost in 2025 dollars of $25. Now, okay, so if they'd done safe disposal, it would have, as a small shareholder, it would have cost you $25 in current money. Okay, what would have been saved by doing that? Well, we know, thanks to a detailed scientific study done after the fact, that preventing the leak or the dumping of PFOA into the Ohio River, preventing it would have avoided 4,200 cases of thyroid cancer, 630 cases of kidney cancer, 63 cases of testicular cancer, and 21 cases of ulcerative colitis. Okay, it wasn't easy to predict those costs in advance, but DuPont managers knew PFOA was highly toxic when they dumped it. So let's imagine that the expected damages, a reasonable estimate of the damages, was just 1/10 of what was later found to be the case. So just divide all the numbers I gave by 10. So then, if you were voting on this as a small shareholder, the question you would be asking yourself is, am I willing to bear a personal cost of $25 in return for avoiding, remember I've divided by 10, 420 cases of thyroid cancer, 63 cases of kidney cancer, and 6 cases of testicular cancer, at a total cost, because there's your $25, but then your fellow shareholders are bearing the rest of the cost, which is 58 million minus $25. Okay, so that's the question you have to ask yourself. And I think the answer is any reasonable estimate of the cost of all those cases for thyroid cancer and et cetera, would lead you to the conclusion that actually $58 million is a small price to pay for all those. Remember, it's $58 million 2025 dollars. And just think if you put the value of life, some people would put it at $10 million. So, if you save 5 lives, it's worth it. And here we're talking about much, much more than that. And the amount it's affecting you personally is only $25. So I would like to think that everybody in this room would say, yes, we should bear the cost. We shouldn't have dumped it in the Ohio River, but of course they never asked. Okay, so the evidence is, there's plenty of evidence that people are public-spirited enough. So I'm not going to spend time on the evidence, but there is evidence of people have been asked, how much are you willing to give up for this and that and the rest? And I think it's pretty clear that the vast majority of people would be willing to make this trade. And in other words, if shareholder preferences had been taken into account by DuPont at the time, they would have done something different from what they did do. And so that's why a lot of what I'm talking about today is how shareholder preferences should be taken into account, and why actually, therefore, the conventional wisdom, or what Milton Friedman said actually, is incorrect, right? Because he was saying that companies should maximize profit. They shouldn't give to charity. Well, I agree with him about that. But also that perhaps they should dump stuff into the Ohio River. I don't know. He didn't actually talk about that particular case. But I think it's wrong. I think that actually shareholders, if they're asked what their companies should do, they might actually tell them, please act in a socially responsible way. Now, before I go on, let me deal with an important point. So some people would say, they might say, well, we sort of agree with some of what you're saying, but they would say, but wait a minute, isn't it the job of government, not companies, to solve pollution problems by imposing appropriate regulations? So they would say the problem with the DuPont case is that there wasn't a regulator there to say you can't dump stuff into the Ohio River. This is what we teach in economics textbooks, actually. We say it's just fine for companies to maximize profit as long as we have appropriate government regulation. So at this point, I want to say that we, Luigi and I, reject this approach because what this approach ignores is that companies, in the name of profit maximization, often prevent appropriate regulation. So let me give you, actually DuPont does this to some extent and did it throughout the period that I'm talking about. So one of the things DuPont does is it hires previous regulators to be to work for them, and so you know, that makes it quite attractive for a regulator. To the extent there is a regulator looking at what DuPont is doing, it's quite attractive for a regulator to think, well, if I treat DuPont sort of softly, then who knows, I may have a job at DuPont in 3 years. And that's exactly what happened with this kind of cozy relationship between regulators, and not just DuPont, but many other companies. Let me give you another example. ExxonMobil has for many years lobbied against sensible climate regulation. So, you know, here we have the possibility of regulation. The way economists often think about it is the regulator is some sort of independent entity or a group of people who will come up with the right regulations to control company behavior. But, you know, I just gave the example of DuPont having a cozy relationship with regulators, and ExxonMobil also does this kind of thing. It lobbies against sensible climate regulation, and it has also supported questionable science that downplayed the seriousness of climate change, all in the name of profit maximization. So effectively, you have companies that claim to be acting on behalf of shareholders because they're maximizing profit, which is assumed to be the thing that shareholders want. But in doing that, they're actually subverting the regulatory process, which you need to be operating to make profit maximization a good goal for companies. So just to summarize this slide then, the idea that we can rely on regulation and just let companies maximize profit, that breaks down if, as part of profit maximization, companies actually influence regulators and subvert the regulatory process. And then the only way to actually make progress is for the shareholders of the company to tell the companies, wait a minute, we don't want you to be doing this. Okay, so takeaways, so back to DuPont, what we saw there was that small shareholders may actually be very public-spirited. If you ask them about what DuPont was doing, you know, that was the example where you had this shareholder who, at a cost of $25 for themselves, was actually making a social benefit cost decision. You know, they were saying, well, the cost to the other shareholders is, was it 58 million? But the benefit to society is preventing all this illness. Do I want to do it? It's actually the same calculation that a social planner would make. So if you think about, you know, in economics, we often talk about a public-spirited central planner, a social planner, who maximizes social surplus. And actually, a small shareholder is effectively doing that, in my example, because the cost to them is only the $25, and the rest of it is the social benefit cost calculation. So there's every reason to believe they will come out with the right answer to that. And that also just suggests that we need to find out what shareholders want. In other words, it's going to be much better if we have shareholders influencing corporate decisions rather than having executives who may be on very high-powered compensation packets. Maybe they're rewarded according to profit or share value, and therefore they're going to be pushing profit maximization, which is not what a public-spirited shareholder may want. Okay, so that's sort of the end of part one. Let me just say that a lot of my talk is about situations where you have a lot of small shareholders, rather than a situation where you have an insider that has a very large share block and has perhaps majority voting control. And I know that many Israeli companies are in this category, and in that case, some of what I'm saying is much less relevant because the insider is going to make the decision anyway. It doesn't matter what the small shareholders think. You have this controlling shareholder who probably, you know, for them, you know, in my example, it's not just about, imagine a big shareholder of DuPont. It wouldn't just be a cost of $25. It would be a much bigger cost to them if they don't dump in the Ohio River. And so the money side of it might have much greater significance for them. So, you know, much of what I'm talking about is companies with many small shareholders, and I recognize that not all, you know, many Israeli companies are not in that category, but some important Israeli companies are, Bank Leumi being, or Leumi, if I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, being an example. Okay, so this is, if you like, the end of part one. The basic point was to argue that the shareholders of companies, to the extent they're at all public-spirited, to the extent they care about anybody else but themselves, might actually want companies not to maximize profit or share value, but might actually want them to act in a socially responsible way. And so now I want to turn to how one could bring that about. And one possibility is to adopt what's called So now if I'm thinking about mutual funds, so actually, so far I've sort of been talking about the shareholders of companies, but most people these days they invest through mutual funds. And in the US, there are three big ones. The three biggest ones are Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street. And I think many people in Israel are also, through their pensions, I assume, are investing through mutual funds. And so one of the things that, actually I'm not even sure this is, it's really worth spending too much time on this, but I said that earlier that the mutual funds were, if you go back to, I think, the second slide, were voting in companies on our behalf without most of us even realizing this is happening. One of the things they've done recently is to say, and it's because of various pressure on them, they've said, you know what, we're going to let our investors vote themselves. So, for example, if you own 1,000 shares in the Vanguard S&P 500 index fund, so this is a fund which is invested in the 500 most important American companies, it's a mutual fund, and so you hold shares in that, then you're holding a little bit of the 500 most important companies in the US, and I'm sure there are Israeli equivalents of that. Then it turns out you indirectly own approximately 80 shares of Microsoft. Until recently, when the time for the Microsoft shareholder meeting came around, the annual meeting, somebody or a group of people, a committee from Vanguard, decided how to cast these 80 votes that you had. Now, with pass-through voting, Vanguard comes to you and says, well, how do you want to vote them? How do you want to vote them? So it's a form of direct democracy, and means you could vote on something which wasn't profit maximizing, if that's the way you felt. And the big three, Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, have tried this so far, but with limited success. And that's partly because people are rationally apathetic. If you're told, you know what, you can vote on a bunch of things now, you may take the view that, well, I'm a very small investor, my vote is not going to be decisive, so why should I bother? I've got better things to do, I can watch TV in the evenings, and so the take-up rate of this has been quite small. So I want to turn to a different approach, which is one that Luigi and I, together with a political scientist at Yale called Elaine Landemore, this is one that we have worked on and think is a more promising way forward to have shareholder voices be heard. And this is the idea of an investor assembly. So let me explain to you briefly what this is. So investor assemblies are inspired by citizens' assemblies, which have been used in the political context. As far as I know from talking to people in Israel, citizens' assemblies are not a well-known concept here, but they are becoming increasingly known in other countries, in particular in various European countries. So what are they? They are relatively large. So let me start off with the political context, and then I'm going to show you how they could be used in the investment context. They are relatively large bodies of individuals, 100 or more people, chosen at random, technically through stratified random sampling, from the larger population of citizens to deliberate on important social and political issues. So it turns out they're a very old idea. They were popular in ancient Greece over 2,000 years ago, fell out of fashion, but are now coming back. You can think of large juries aimed to capture the full diversity of a population and ideally offer an accurate demographic mini-portrait of it. Unlike juries, though, participation is voluntary. So let me give you some examples. In Ireland, they had a citizens' assembly which proposed new abortion and same-sex marriage laws. So Ireland used to have an incredibly restrictive abortion law, and there was a feeling that things should change. The politicians couldn't figure out how to do it, so they decided to have the citizens propose something. Well, of course, they couldn't have several million people do it, so instead what they did, they had a citizens' assembly. So they randomly selected 100 or 150, I can't remember, I think it was maybe 100 people, and they had them deliberate on what a reasonable new abortion law would look like, and they did the same thing for same-sex marriage. And then the proposal, of course this assembly couldn't implement that, but what happened was the assembly's recommendation then went to a countrywide referendum, and in both cases, abortion and same-sex marriage, it was passed and therefore became law. And something similar happened in France. There was a law on climate justice and end-of-life issues. There were citizens' assemblies on both those things. And the first one, the climate justice one, shaped the 2021 climate and resilience law. So in the case of France, they didn't have a referendum, a countrywide referendum. Instead, it went through the political process. And not all of it was adopted, but some of it was adopted, the recommendations of the Assembly. That was the climate and resilience law. The end-of-life issues, that one is still to be acted on. There are many other examples of them. So what we are proposing is to apply this idea to the investor context. So we think it could be done at the company level, but we think it makes sense in the first instance to do it at the intermediary level, because most people these days hold shares in companies through intermediaries. In the US case, I don't know whether it's the case in Israel, but in, say, I mentioned the big three, Vanguard, State Street, BlackRock. So people are holding their investments through these institutions. Maybe they're pension investments or other investments. So how would it work if we did it at the intermediary level? Let's take Vanguard. Vanguard would randomly choose 100 or 150 of its investors. Let's say in its S&P 500 index fund, all the people investing in that, they would randomly pick 100 or 150 of them, and they would then meet, they would be compensated for their time and expenses because they can't be required to serve, right? They have to be induced to agree to participate in this process, so you have to compensate them. Before the lottery, each investor can opt out and do their own voting, so we don't force anyone to be in this. Now, in the Citizens' Assembly, it's one, everybody has the same chance of being selected to be in the Assembly. In the case of the Irish one, for example. In the investment context, that doesn't make as much sense because, some people have more money invested in the Vanguard S&P 500 fund. And so in the investment context, we're more familiar with the idea of one share, one vote than one person, one vote. Not everyone likes that, but I think it's a fact of life. So what we suggest is that someone with a greater investment in the Vanguard fund would have a higher probability of being chosen. They won't have more votes in the Assembly. The Assembly, remember, is going to have about 100 people in it, but someone with a greater investment will have a higher chance of being randomly selected. But once it's in the Assembly, it's one person, one vote. Members will be provided with informational resources, briefing materials, and access to experts, so they will be able to call experts to come and testify about various issues. They're going to meet online and in person to discuss and deliberate, and they will then make recommendations about Vanguard, because remember, I took Vanguard as an example, about Vanguard's voting and engagement strategy going forward. So rather than Vanguard doing everything, or Vanguard passing through votes to, as in pass-through voting to investors in the fund, in the S&P 500 fund, instead, this assembly will recommend what Vanguard management should be doing in the future in terms of voting and engagement. So let's take, I don't know how I'm doing for time, but let's take I think I'm doing okay actually, but maybe I'm not. I hope I am. Here's what could happen. The first investor assembly could discuss lobbying campaigns. So I gave the example of ExxonMobil that lobbies against carbon taxes. Okay, so that's a lobbying campaign. The first investor assembly at Vanguard could decide, do we think this is a good idea? Do we think that companies should obtain shareholder approval for their lobbying campaigns? Later investor assemblies could deliberate on how to respond to particular lobbying campaigns. So ExxonMobil could come and say, you know what, we want to lobby against carbon taxes because we think they're a bad idea. And the Vanguard Investor Assembly could deliberate about that and decide, you know what, we think that's it's a terrible idea for ExxonMobil to be lobbying against carbon taxes because we actually think carbon taxes are the solution to climate change. So we're going to say no, and we're going to vote against, if ExxonMobil tries to do this, we will actually support a resolution which tells them to stop doing this. As another example, the Assembly could consider whether Vanguard should support a shareholder proposal to end the use of antibiotics in large-scale poultry farming. So there could be, Costco is a company which you may be familiar with. It uses antibiotics in the poultry that it sells, and this contributes to the development of antibiotic resistance and puts human lives at risk. So it could be profit maximizing, but it could be contrary to the interests of its shareholders. Well, the Vanguard, the S&P 500 fund, they are holding shares in Costco, and so this investor assembly could decide, you know what, we want to support, we don't want Costco to be doing this. So any shareholder proposal saying that they should stop this, we want Vanguard to support it. So they would be actually directing Vanguard what to do. As a third example, food companies produce products designed to be addictive. The Assembly could consider whether Vanguard should push these companies to change the ingredients so that they're less addictive, or at least put warning signs on the packets. Okay, so one of the main criticisms of citizens' assemblies, and likely of investor assemblies, is that randomly drawn people don't have the expertise to make competent decisions. But investor assemblies will not be asked to calculate the optimal hedging strategy against interest rate risk, some technical issue that they are totally unqualified to deal with. Instead, they'll be asked if they're willing to accept a lower return on their investments to reduce the development of antibiotic resistance. That's just, the Costco example. And so when the Assembly is considering this issue, they can ask for experts to appear before them, and they can have financial experts who can tell them about the financial cost of doing this. If Costco doesn't use antibiotics anymore in its poultry production, then that's going to be expensive. It's going to reduce profits. On the other hand, medical experts can come along and tell them about the social benefits from not having antibiotic resistance. The final trade-off, though, is a moral decision. Are you willing to give up this amount of money to have this social gain? It's a moral decision, and who should be making that decision? Currently, such decisions are made by company boards or asset managers, but these people were never picked for their moral ability or aptitude. The people who are best qualified to make these kind of trade-off decisions are the ultimate investors who suffer the economic consequences of the decisions, but who might be willing to accept those costs if they are sufficiently socially responsible. So let me, few more slides. So, is this pie in the sky? Could it ever happen? Well, actually, not only could it happen, but it is happening. So it turns out that Emmeline Cooper and Rob Bauer persuaded a Dutch pension fund in 2024. They were working independently of Luigi, Hélène, and me, but we similar ideas. They persuaded them to organize an investor assembly to discuss responsible investment. So in their case, it wasn't just about how to push companies, it was also about which companies to invest in. We're less keen on that. We're more interested in engagement than in divestment. But anyway, they did it, and this worked out quite well. The pension fund came up with a number of proposals which were submitted to the board of the investor assembly came up with proposals which were submitted to the board of the pension fund, and the pension fund then acted on many of these proposals. There's a question of whether the assembly's decisions should be mandatory or on Vanguard, in my Vanguard example, or advisory. We think, at least to begin with, they should be advisory. Emmeline Cooper is now working with a large pension fund in the UK to set up an investor assembly. Okay, so let me conclude, and I hope that what I've said hasn't been too kind of all over the place, and the message is coming through. But let me, in case it hasn't, let me summarize, and hope it does now. So the conventional wisdom in economics is that a firm's sole objective should be to maximize profit. This is not the goal most individuals have when they act on their own. We don't all just maximize our income. If we're academics, we are often accepting a lower income than we could get in some other activity. We could work in the investment sector. Personally, I couldn't. I would never be hired. But a lot of my colleagues could and could make much more money, but they choose not to do that because they like what they're doing. So, the idea that people are only interested in money is incorrect. And also people, are socially responsible in their own lives. They don't litter the street, even though it might be in their, it might be privately optimal to, if they didn't care about anybody else, that they would just drop pieces of litter. They're not too worried about being arrested for that. But they don't do it because they have a conscience. So the point is that there's plenty of evidence that just self-interested behavior is not the way many of us act. But somehow in the corporate sector, it's been assumed that we are this way, that we're only interested in money. And it's, I hope, as my examples have shown, this is not the case. Companies and mutual funds need to listen to their investors to find out what they want. Whether they want DuPont to dump a toxic substance in the Ohio River in order to, yes, make more money, but put lives at risk. If asked, they might, I would hope they would say, no, we don't want you to do that. And one thing, I gave you the example of ExxonMobil. They actually undermine the regulatory process. that economists think is the solution to everything. And the only way to stop that, actually, is to have the shareholders act. As a very small shareholder in Exxon, it's not in my interest. I am a very small shareholder in Exxon, and you may be as well, because you know, if you hold a mutual fund, it's going to have, certainly in the US if you have one, it's going to have a little bit of Exxon in it. And so I make a little bit of money from Exxon doing all this stuff about lobbying against sensible climate regulation as they do. But as a citizen, I suffer. And also because I care about everybody else a little bit, that also affects me. If I was asked, I would say to Exxon, please stop doing that. It's profit maximizing, but it's not actually in the interest of me as a shareholder. So we want shareholder voices to be heard, and that's why we're writing our book, to create the awareness necessary for things to change, for a move to shareholder democracy, for shareholders' voices to be heard. We call it a quiet revolution, because it's not, you know, people don't have to go into the streets and shoot, and you know, no violence is necessary, I don't think. But to bring it about, we need pressure for investors like you or me on companies and institutions. But if we have that, it can happen. And some of the bad behavior that currently corporations carry out can be prevented. But you know, companies do many good things as well. So we're well aware we don't want to close them down or do anything or nationalize them. We just want them to behave better. And we think that by having investors' voices be heard, that can happen. Thank you very much.
I heard of once in a lullaby. Somewhere over the rainbow, skies are blue, and the dreams that you dared to dream really do come true. Someday I'll wish upon a star and wake up where the clouds are far behind me, where troubles melt like lemon drops away above the chimney tops. That's where you'll find me. Somewhere over the rainbow, bluebirds fly. If birds can fly over the rainbow, then why can't I? If happy little bluebirds fly beyond the rainbow, why can't
Thank you to Rייכמן University Band, Donatella Maimon, Roy Meirman, and Natalie Tabibi. And we'd like to proceed with our panel, so I'd like to invite Dr. Ruth Dagan, Head of Climate and International Collaboration at the Ariston ESG Center, Uri Levin, CEO of Tidhar Group, and Elal Kalai, Chairman of IBI Trust Funds and Head of Corporate Responsibility at IBI Investment House, and of course, Professor Oliver Hart. So I'll start with you, Ruth. You've been a long-time practitioner in the field of environmental and climate change law. And so I'd like to have your take on, from your experience, how this concept of investor assembly can translate into real-life dynamics in the Israeli economy. And allow me to be a bit more specific. You know, we are Israelis, we kind of oftentimes emphasize short-term. So like, how would like a short-term versus long-term perspective reflect on the applicability of the investor assembly idea?
Thanks, Niron. And before I begin, Sir Hart, thank you so much for joining us for this end-of-the-year event. We're honored to have you here. And I want to thank the Ariston Foundation for supporting us throughout these past few years and into the future. And to the entire audience, stay tuned. We have many interesting projects coming up in 2026. Now, to your question. So I'm really intrigued by this concept of investor assemblies and, of course, like basically dedicating my entire career to environment and climate change and how it plays out in the corporate sector and the financial sector. This is a really compelling notion. I'm thinking of how it translates into the Israeli corporate environment specifically, and I think there can probably be no argument that the Israeli ecosystem is really saturated with very quick decision-making that is just part of reality because of short-termism and constant crisis mode. This specifically applies to the sector that I work with a lot, which is the industrial manufacturing and electricity production sectors. And environmental issues are, of course, very relevant there. And everything is very reactive. So the ability to make long-term strategic decisions does exist, but the environmental concepts would come into play into there, like high-level notions that everybody agrees on, but then ultimately when it comes time to make the actual real-time decision that's much more granular, then it's always crisis mode, and unless the actual crisis is an environmental issue, then the environmental issue will always take second place naturally. That's just the reality of Israel. Now, when I think of how to actually implement investor assemblies within this specific realistic environment, then I think of two potential challenges. One is, who will actually decide on the question that is being put to the investor assembly? Who will be the entity or the person who decides what the agenda for them is? That's one. And the second is, what would be the actual language of that question? Because you can take it to, for example, a very high level of saying, like Professor Hart, you gave the example of decisions on lobbying. So there can be a high-level question put to the assembly saying, let's decide that the company will not lobby against more stringent environmental regulation. That would be the high-level question. And the more granular question that can be put in this respect to the assembly is to say, at a lower level, okay, we have a specific production line with quite harmful chemical. If we decide to refrain from lobbying against more stringent regulation in this specific scenario, that means we need to close down production. That means massive layoffs within the company, and that can also have a social side. So for me, sort of to sum this up, I would have to say that it would be interesting to know what your position would be on if we take the perspective of posing the high-level questions, then we risk the distortion of contingent valuation, because we all like to think of ourselves as being very environmental and very immoral, but then when it comes to actually paying at the grocery store, then we might not make that actual choice. So that would be the high level. And then if you take the approach of the lower level, the more granular and practical real-life scenario, that can cause real legal exposure, because, for example, the DuPont scenario would never come to life within an actual decision. That would be like admitting and creating significant legal liability for that company. So for me, I would really be interested in hearing your opinion on how, in practice, in granularity, that can come into play. Thanks.
Thank you, Ruth. So I think we'll go through everyone and then you can comment. That's okay?
Well, I might forget. That's the problem. Okay.
Okay, so Uri.
Does this work?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Okay. So given what Ruti just said, in your opinion, like, what's the best way to advance like sustainable behavior of businesses? And maybe if you can be more, like, do you think Israel is different than other countries in that respect?
Hey, thank you, Mr. Hart, Professor Hart, for what you've said. And I suspect, like most CEOs you've met, when you've proposed this agenda, you probably got the response that they found that very challenging. As we CEOs, we don't like people to tell us what to do, and so there's a...
I rarely speak to CEOs, so actually, you're a CEO.
Yes,
this is great. I've actually met one. Okay.
But I would say that my challenge comes from, not from that point, but from trying to see how we can make ESG values, or how we can make companies do good in a way that can be sustainable, in a way that can be persistent. And for me, there's only one way. I typically, when I speak in ESG conferences, and for some reason I speak in quite a lot, I actually start by saying that I'm a little bit contrarian to ESG, because I believe that forcing companies to act in a specific way is not the right way to lead companies and not the right way to get results. And I believe at the end of the day, governments should set the rules of the game, and companies should play within this field according to the rules and moral rules. But I do think that companies at the end has to focus on producing profit. I say that, and I still am a big supporter of the ESG-related values. And I actually also think that it aligns with the way I lead companies and the way I think other managers lead companies. And the reason is, you said your main change is, let's move from shareholder value to shareholder welfare. And my belief is that companies, board of directors, management, should lead profit, shareholder profit, with one change, shareholder long-term profit. And I think that that change is very substantial. Because if I am to lead long-term sustainable profit for my company, I cannot do it for a long term without thinking about the entire community around me, without thinking about the stakeholders, without thinking about the clients, the suppliers, the partners, the employees, the community, and the environment. If I'm thinking long term, then over-investing in my clients will probably lead to greater results. If I'll exploit my clients in some way, at some point, that will turn back and will hurt my long-term profits. and maybe just the existence of the company. If I will exploit my suppliers, the same will happen. If I will not invest in my employees, I will not have the employees leading together with me the future of the company and getting the best results. If I will if I will work in a way that will pollute the environment for the long term, that will return in a lawsuit at some point and will hurt the long-term value and the long-term profit of the company. So I do think that the only way to lead these values in a sustainable way is to find a way that it aligns with the incentives of the company and the incentives of the CEO. And that means that more management and board should understand that that long-term perspective means working in a good way with employees, with suppliers, with partners, with clients, with the environments. And in that way, I think there's alignment, and in that way, I think these values can be achieved. And what does it mean in practice in relation to what the examples that you've said? I think it means that we push for these values as much as we can. I'm a real estate company CEO, and I do care about environment, and I do care about, unfortunately, real estate is one of the most polluting industries in the world. And I push for better solutions as long as they're profitable. I will not be able to push it furthermore because I'll end up not being profitable. I will not be profitable. I will not be in the business. Some other company will build in a way that is much worse for the economy. And even if a group of investors will tell me to do so, will end up, if it's not aligned with the incentive of the companies, will not happen. So I just conclude that and say that I believe that by focusing on shareholder value, but long-term value, and understanding that there's an alignment between doing good to the stakeholders and shareholder value for the long term, I think that's the best way to go forward. I'll just say one word on Israel. It's very hard to speak ESG in Israel. In a country where our democracy is in crisis, that war is still ongoing, and when we open yesterday's newspaper, and it's like 10 years of a normal country of devastating news. To speak about environment is hard. To speak about ESG values, there's a lot of cynicism around it. I do believe that we, as leaders in the academy and in the business, we have to remember that this is part of our success. We have to remember that this is something that we need to continue and do. But I also think that in Israel, there's also one thing that is even more important than that. I just said that there should be alignment between the company goals and what we do according to ESG. I think there's one thing that I actually treat differently, and that is what we do for Israel, what we do for the democracy, and how we take these values and do something different. I could relate that also to the company and say that I do think that business leaders should act, her voice should be heard, should try and impact the economy, the democracy, the country as much as possible, because democracy is economy, and if we won't support it, then our companies will not be viable. But actually, I think it's more than that. I think that at the end of the day in Israel, when we speak about values, we realize, unfortunately, in recent years, that we have a role as leaders to be there for our country and to do whatever we can to protect the democracy, to protect the liberal values, to protect our country, to make sure that it's the country we want to have, even if there's a price that we pay at the personal level or the company level. I don't know why. I'm not sure I have a rationale for this. I just know that as CEO, when I spoke to my clients and my employees, when I did think that were a little bit at question not everyone has agreed to, my answer was that I just felt that I have to, that's my role in this country. And I think that's one change that we have in Israel.
So thank you very much, Uri.
Can I reply to this?
Yes.
Because I think the trouble is I forget what people, although I wouldn't forget what you had said, actually. But I think you have a rather optimistic view of long-run shareholder value. So DuPont decided to dump this stuff in the Ohio River, and eventually there was a lawsuit, and they had to pay damages. But in fact, the damages they paid were really a pretty small fraction of the total costs they imposed on the world, on the community. So it probably wasn't, you know, they made a small loss. But the thing is, okay, so from a shareholder value maximization point of view, probably it wasn't an ideal strategy, but it wasn't a terrible strategy either. So, I mean, that's an example where maximizing shareholder value actually led to a very bad outcome socially. And I can give you many other examples. Two that should certainly resonate with this audience involves General Motors, which supplied the Nazi regime in Germany with the ability to make tanks and helped them to invade Poland. We have a quote from a high-ranking Nazi at the time who said, without General Motors technology, we wouldn't have invaded Poland. Okay, has General Motors suffered tremendously from this? No. IBM provided computer technology to the Nazi regime, which helped them keep track of Jews in the 1930s. Did IBM seriously suffer from this? No. Long-run shareholder value maximization doesn't seem to always deliver a good outcome. Now, the interesting question is if General Motors had actually asked its shareholders at the time, we're actually talking about the period after 1939, but before 1941, when the US became, you know, declared war on Germany. But there was that period when there was war in Europe, but there wasn't, the US was out of it. Okay, so if GM shareholders had been asked whether they wanted, because this came up at a shareholders meeting, okay, but there was never a vote by the shareholders. What would they have voted? I'm not sure they would have voted the way I would have liked, but at least they could have been asked. Similarly with IBM, we don't know how they would have voted, but it would be interesting if they had had the chance. I think the idea that companies that make terrible decisions, that have huge costs, eventually suffer for it, it's just not, the evidence doesn't support it. So that's why profit maximization, even long-run shareholder value maximization, doesn't always deliver a socially desirable outcome, and why I think shareholder democracy can do better. We don't know whether it will, but at least, you know, if the shareholders say, okay, we want you to do this terrible thing, so be it. At least we ask them. Mostly they're not asked. But anyway, I just disagree with you that the long run is going to solve all our problems. I think there are many examples where a long run perspective, it doesn't seem the companies that have done terrible things don't actually suffer in the long run, after all.
Thank you, Oliver.
I could respond to
no, but let me ask Ella,
well,
and then you will be concluding that. Okay, let me just let Ella.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So Ella, I want to actually build on Uri's saying, and like, do you think that the citizen assembly model can help us prevent the degradation of the Israeli democracy? If we are talking about that, yeah.
Right. So let me say a few things. One is thank you for allowing us to think out of the box and look at a new model for things that have been failing in our reality, and I think they have been failing both on the government level, parliament level, and on corporate level. So So thank you for those ideas. And I think that the idea of having reverted back to Athens and to a form of citizen or investor assembly does sound interesting in the sense that, well, in the government and the parliament level, it makes sense because of the polarization and because we're looking at representatives that have to take a very narrow stand for their specific voters. And if we could, like in Ireland, form a citizens' assembly that sort of mix that up in a different fashion, possibly we would get different answers as they have. So that's an interesting idea. Hopefully someone here will try it. Regarding an investors' assembly, I would like to say, well, maybe on the borderline, I would like to sort of add to what the CEO said, in the sense that in Israel, given the current environment and the current government and our level of corporate responsibility, it seems sort of redundant to speak about it on a level of, on a corporate level, given our current environment. So, but hopefully that will change and we will be able to return to corporate responsibility. And in that sense, I would like to say two things. One is that the experience of ESG investors, basically you have today, the market allows people to make the moral choice. They can invest given ESG categories, and they can choose to invest in companies that do less harm or in companies that possibly maximize profit. So on the level of an individual investor, a small investor, people theoretically have the choice, and they obviously make the wrong choice, the wrong moral choice, but they do have the ability to voice their preference by where they put their money. So that would be one thought. Another thought would be that I think part of what I found really interesting in your presentation is that basically the way to bring the information to the investor assembly is really important because it could be populist and then you would get the worst of all worlds, or it could be very balanced and measured. And then I would argue that if you have a way, an economic way, to develop this data, to develop this information that would support an investor assembly, then possibly just use it on the current institutions. Possibly just, make it available to institutional investors and make it available to company boards. And as people, they would probably also make I want to say preferable decision, given that information. And I would like to add to that part, I think, of our difficulty in making the right decision is still based on what we said, that short-term versus long-term. Because we find it really, really difficult to take the long-term stand. And we make decisions given on the way we currently view the balance. And the more information you give people to force them to think about the longer term, probably the better their decision-making in the process will be, or at least your colleagues, Kanan and Fursky, would like us to think that.
Can I respond? I've got to get to Ruth at the end. Okay, two responses. you talked about how you can invest in, one way you can be effective is to decide which companies to invest in, right? Which is not about voting or anything like that. It's just choosing where to put your money. This turns out, I didn't talk about this, but it's certainly in some of the articles we've written already, and it will be part of the book. This turns out to be a very ineffective way of expressing your views, because if I, for example, if I decide I'm not going to hold shares in oil companies, then somebody else will hold them. Or if I sell my shares, if I discover one morning, oh, I've inherited some shares in an oil company, how terrible. I want to get out as quickly as possible. I sell those shares and somebody else buys them. The price doesn't change. This is the evidence that there are plenty of people who have, who don't have the moral concerns you have, who are happy to take your shares. And if the price started to fall at all, they would swoop in and buy them up, and the price wouldn't change. And so you will have no effect on company behavior. A lot of evidence supporting that view. So you might feel better about it, but you've actually had no impact.
Why are you assuming that the people that you put on your investor assembly will be different in that sense, in that respect? Because, they still have a financial...
the reason because when it comes to voting on things, the calculus is extremely different. So go back to my DuPont example. If you were thinking about how to vote on that, you would be saying, am I willing to give up $25 to prevent a huge amount of illness? And the answer is, I think for almost everybody, yes, they would. And so you would vote for, so if it was a choice of dumping the toxic waste, the PFOA in the Ohio River, or disposing of it safely, you would vote to dispose of it safely. And if there are a lot of people like you, that's the majority's decision would be that. And so you would actually get a socially very efficient outcome. It's entirely different from, the difference is that when you vote, you're not hurting yourself while other people, there's no, what economists call, there's no free rider problem, because if you vote and you're in the majority, everybody pays, right? They all pay their $25. And if you're in the minority, nobody pays, including you. So you're not thinking to yourself, do I want to spend $25 and nobody else is going to have to pay anything, in which case you might decide not to bother. You only pay if everybody else pays. So it's an entirely different calculus from the decision to sell your shares in a company. So that's one of the reasons. So that was one thing. Sorry, what was the other? The trouble, limited memory is that
before you move to Ruth, so just one follow-up on that, okay? Yeah. So why are you assuming that a group of institutional investors having the same issue presented to them that way would not vote like an investors' assembly?
A group of institutional, the trouble is, yes, I think, sorry, maybe this was the other thing I was going to say. We've all been, companies have been primed, they've been educated. I don't want to blame Milton Friedman entirely for this, it would be far too strong, but I think the economics and finance professions have supported the idea that you're doing God's work by maximizing profit. Or shareholder value. And then people say, okay, long-run shareholder value, that's doing God's work. As my examples of IBM and General Motors show, but there are plenty of other examples, sometimes the long run never comes. You can do very bad stuff. It's not a good idea, probably, to mistreat your customers or your workers or the people your stakeholder, the people with whom you have a contractual relationship, that can come back to bite you if you mistreat them. And there's plenty of evidence that actually reputation, it doesn't, it could be a short run gain, but a long run, it's not going to work out. If you want to be a great company, you have to treat people well, otherwise they won't do business with you. The environment is entirely different. The environment doesn't do business with you. You can do very bad things to the environment, and there's nobody there to complain. And the evidence is you don't get punished for that. And that's why having shareholders be able to express their voice through something like an investor assembly, that can make a difference, because coming back to my DuPont example, where are you willing to give up $25 in order to have all this great, to avoid all these social costs? And the majority might well say yes, and that could be an investor assembly could convey that message to the company or to Vanguard, who would then push the company. That's what we want. That's what we want. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I'm ready.
Yes, you're all right. So I think the trouble is, I knew this would happen because you went first. I knew I would forget. No, I know one thing you said, which I think was important, is how do they... so it was about how the issues are decided, that they're going to consider. They're not going to be given to them by Vanguard, or if it was at the company level, by the company. So the investor assembly would be empowered to decide what they're going to decide, what they're going to advise on, what issues. So they, if they lobbying, I gave the example of political lobbying, that would come from them. Yes.
So the agenda itself would come from the investor assembly, and they would be setting the agenda of questions. I understand that. The question then becomes, how would they come about the information that they even need to ask a specific question, because you don't know what you don't know. That's one. And second, how would a scenario, the type of DuPont, the DuPont scenario, how would that even come into play? I realistically don't see that coming up within an investor assembly, because they simply wouldn't have the information, and no legal counsel of a corporation or of a fund would allow that to see the light of day. So for me, in my mind, the questions would always be at a very low resolution level, and the higher resolution would never come into play. And then the ultimate decision-making, if we come back to the Israeli scenario, is a very, very high resolution and immediate decisions that are very granular, like the DuPont scenario, for example.
So, first of all, we imagine that every year there would be an investor assembly at Vanguard, say, and the investor assembly would know what the previous investor assembly, it would be a new group of people. You don't want the same group of people. So they would be randomly selected. And so a new group would see what the previous group had considered and would have a new set of things to consider. So that's one thing that would be happening. In terms of, so one of the things you were asking was, how would DuPont shareholders know anything about this? This is an excellent question, because in fact, of course, they didn't know. The decision was made by management. What we actually have in mind, this is something we will discuss in the book, is having an ombudsperson on the board whose job would be to tell shareholders about things that are relevant for them. So we would want to have a system whereby decisions with social significance would get all the way up to the board. That's the first thing. Not even clear by the way, that the PFOA decision, the decision to dump it in the Ohio River, it's not clear that ever reached the board level. But that seems to me to be a fault with, I think there are now processes in US companies at least by which decisions like that will get all the way up to the board. Now, if you have an ombudsperson sitting on the board, this is a person who would not be compensated in shares or anything like that, maybe a fixed compensation. And their job would be, if there was some decision coming up with social significance, they would actually make this known to the DuPont Investor Assembly. So that's how it would happen. That would be their job. So that issues of social significance are something that shareholders are told about, and they can then make a decision about them.
Thank you.
So,
was there another thing? But I'm not sure that I've answered. Yeah.
So, like, when you get such, I think, thought-provoking ideas from a Nobel laureate, the discussion could go on for the entire of the evening. So, I'd like to thank Professor Hart and the panel for joining us. And I'd like to thank you for bearing with us, and the Arisson family and the Arisson Foundation for the impressive presence, for the students, and for the team that organized all that, Daria, Tamar, and all the others. And see you next year in our annual event. And stay tuned and follow us in all the things we do at the Arisson ESG Center. Thank you very much and good evening.